The Prison Continent: How Australia Survived Its Brutal Beginning. In 1788, 11 ships carrying over 1,400 people, more than half of them convicts in chains, arrived at the edge of the known world. They had sailed for 8 months across 3 oceans to reach a land that Europeans knew almost nothing about. This wasn't colonization as the world had seen it before. This was an experiment. Could you build a functioning society using criminals as your primary labor force? 15,000 miles from home, on a continent that seemed determined to kill you? Welcome to the story of Australia's founding, a tale of desperation, brutality, and against all odds, survival. This is the story of how Britain tried to solve its prison crisis by creating a prison continent. To understand why Britain would attempt something so audacious, we need to go back to the streets of Georgian England. By the 1780s, Britain had a problem. Actually, Britain had several problems, but the one keeping magistrates awake at night was overflowing with prisoners. Crime was rampant in British cities. But here's the thing. What we'd consider minor offenses today could get you hanged. Stealing a loaf of bread, death penalty. Pickpocketing a handkerchief, death penalty. Poaching a rabbit, you guessed it, death penalty. There were over 200 crimes punishable by death, and they called it the Bloody Code. But executing people for petty theft was creating another problem. Juries refused to convict because they didn't want someone's death on their conscience for stealing food. So judges got creative. They started commuting death sentences to transportation, shipping convicts to colonies where they'd provide 7 to 14 years of forced labor. For decades, this system worked perfectly. Britain shipped around 50,000 convicts to America. Problem solved. Except in 1776, those ungrateful colonists decided they'd rather govern themselves. The American Revolution didn't just cost Britain 13 colonies, it cost them their dumping ground for criminals. The prisons were bursting. Britain started using decommissioned warships called hulks as floating prisons, anchoring them in the Thames and other rivers. These ships were nightmares, dark, disease-ridden, with prisoners crammed below deck in their own filth. People living near these hulks complained about the stench. Deaths were common. This wasn't a solution. It was a festering wound. Britain needed a new dumping ground, and they needed it fast. In 1779, Joseph Banks, the botanist who had sailed with Captain Cook to the Pacific, suggested a location he'd visited 9 years earlier, a place called Botany Bay on the coast of New South Wales. Banks described it as a paradise with fertile soil, temperate climate, and friendly natives. He was wrong on almost every count. In 1786, Lord Sydney, the Home Secretary, made the decision. They would establish a penal colony at Botany Bay. It would serve multiple purposes: solve the prison crisis, establish British presence in the Pacific to counter French expansion, and possibly, though this was optimistic, become self-sufficient and even profitable. The person chosen to lead this expedition was Captain Arthur Phillip, a naval officer with experience but no experience with anything like this. Nobody did. This had never been attempted before. Philip would be the governor of a colony that didn't exist yet, ruling over subjects who were there against their will in a place he'd never seen. The fleet began assembling. 11 ships in total, 2 Navy vessels for protection and command, 6 transport ships crammed with convicts, 3 store ships loaded with supplies meant to last 2 years. The math was terrifying. They were sailing to the other side of the world with just enough food, tools, and equipment to theoretically survive until they could start producing their own resources. If anything went wrong, if crops failed, if ships sank, if they arrived in the wrong season, everyone would likely die. They loaded 736 convicts, 568 men, and 168 women. Their crimes ranged from serious offenses like highway robbery to absurdly petty ones. 11-year-old John Hudson was transported for stealing clothes. Elizabeth Beckford stole 12 pounds of Gloucester cheese. James Grace stole 2 books. These people would build a nation, though nobody knew it yet. The conditions below deck were medieval. Convicts were kept in chains in dark, cramped spaces. The air was thick and toxic. Disease spread quickly. But here's what's remarkable. Philip did something unusual for his time. He insisted that convicts be allowed on deck for fresh air and exercise. He ordered that their food rations be adequate. He had a Surgeon General, John White, who actually tried to keep people alive. This wasn't kindness, it was pragmatism. Dead convicts couldn't work, and Philip knew that when they arrived, he'd need every able body working at maximum capacity just to survive. The death toll on the voyage was remarkably low compared to later fleets, around 3% mortality, which for an 8-month voyage in the 18th century was almost miraculous. The first fleet departed Portsmouth on May 13th, 1787, 8 months at sea. To put this in perspective, they would sail further than the distance from Earth to the International Space Station if you could make that journey by stacking the distance end to end about 30 times. They sailed south to Tenerife, then across to Rio de Janeiro, then to Cape Town at the southern tip of Africa, then across the Indian Ocean, finally reaching the Australian coast in January 1788. Imagine being a convict on this journey. You've been ripped from everything you know: family, home, country. You're crammed below deck with dozens of others, rocking violently with every wave. You have no idea where you're going except that it's the furthest point from civilization that humans have ever attempted to colonize. You don't know if you'll ever see England again. Most of you won't. The psychological impact was devastating. Some convicts went insane, others became catatonic, but others, and this is important, started to adapt. Hierarchies formed, relationships developed. Some convicts began working with the crew. By the time they spotted Australian land, something strange had happened. This random collection of criminals and guards had started, in some small way, to become a community. On January 18th, 1788, the fleet entered Botany Bay. Philip looked around at the place Joseph Banks had described as paradise and realized they had a problem. The soil was sandy and poor, the harbor was too shallow for the ships, there was insufficient fresh water, and the friendly natives Banks mentioned, the Eora people, were understandably concerned about these strange visitors. Philip made a quick decision. He took a few officers and sailed north to another harbor. Cook had noted but not explored, Port Jackson. When they sailed through the heads into what's now Sydney Harbor, Philip reportedly said it was the finest harbor in the world. He wasn't wrong. Deep water, multiple coves, protection from storms, and a freshwater stream. This would be the place. On January 26, 1788, a date now celebrated as Australia Day and protested as an Invasion Day, Captain Phillip raised the British flag at Sydney Cove. The modern nation of Australia was, in this moment, born. But what a strange birth it was. No independence declaration, no visionary founding fathers, just a naval officer claiming land for a king with prisoners as witnesses. The first few weeks were chaos. Over 1,000 people needed shelter, and there was none. They had to clear land, but the Australian trees were nothing like European trees. The eucalyptus wood was hard as iron and destroyed their axes. The weather was oppressively hot. Remember, they arrived in the middle of summer. People unused to physical labor were suddenly expected to fell trees, dig foundations, and construct buildings in heat that regularly exceeded 38 degrees Celsius. The soil Philip had hoped would support agriculture was, once again, disappointing. It was thin and poor. Seeds they'd brought from England either didn't germinate or produced weak, stunted plants. The livestock they'd transported, sheep, cattle, pigs, chickens, were in poor condition after the voyage. Some wandered off into the bush and vanished. In one instance, an entire herd of cattle disappeared and wasn't found for years. Food supplies were already running lower than planned. Rats had gotten into the stores during the voyage. Some supplies had spoiled. Philip did the math and realized they were already facing potential starvation. He implemented strict rationing. Everyone, officers, soldiers, and convicts, received the same rations. This was revolutionary. In British society, rank meant everything. But Philip understood that in this situation, everyone's survival depended on cooperation. But hunger wasn't the only problem. The Eora people, whose land this was, watched these newcomers with growing alarm. For at least 65,000 years, Aboriginal Australians had thrived on this continent. They had sophisticated land management practices, complex social structures, and deep spiritual connections to the land. To them, the British were incomprehensible. People who didn't understand the land, who cut down trees for no apparent reason, who tried to grow food in all the wrong ways. Initial encounters were tense but not immediately violent. The Eora tried to communicate, some convicts and officers attempted to learn the language, but fundamental misunderstandings made conflict inevitable. The British believed they had the right to take land because they'd raised a flag and made a proclamation. The Eora knew the land wasn't empty. It was theirs, managed and occupied. When the British started hunting the same game the Eora relied on, when they trampled or built on sacred sites, tensions escalated. Governor Phillip tried to maintain peace. He ordered his men not to fire on Aboriginal people without provocation. He attempted to capture and civilize several Eora individuals, hoping they'd serve as intermediaries. This strategy was, unsurprisingly, ineffective and deeply insulting. These kidnappings created resentment and fear. By mid-1789, the colony was starving. The supply ships that were supposed to have arrived hadn't come. Crops had failed. The fishing was poor. Ironically, despite being on the shore of one of the world's finest harbors. British convicts didn't know how to fish in Australian waters. They used European techniques for European fish and caught almost nothing. Rations were cut again and again. People were eating insects, wild plants, anything they could find. Many of these experiments with native foods ended badly. Some plants were toxic. Cases of scurvy exploded. People's teeth fell out. They became too weak to work. The death rate climbed. The Marine officers, the soldiers sent to guard the convicts, were becoming a problem. They hadn't signed up for manual labor, and they made that clear. They expected convicts to serve them, to build their houses first, to give them the best of the limited food. Governor Phillip was constantly mediating disputes between officers who thought rank entitled them to comfort and a brutal reality that didn't care about social hierarchies. Then there was the punishment system. Phillip needed to maintain order among a population consisting mostly of criminals, but he was working within British legal traditions that were spectacularly brutal. Flogging was the standard punishment. Minor infractions meant 25 lashes. Serious ones could mean 300 or more. The cat o' nine tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords, would flay the skin from a person's back. Public floggings were mandatory viewing. Phillip believed that witnessing punishment would deter crime. Instead, it often created resentment and hardened criminals further. Some convicts were flogged so frequently their backs became landscapes of scar tissue. And yet crime persisted. People stole food because they were starving. They attempted escape because they were desperate. The punishment system was designed for deterrence, but when the alternative was death by starvation, deterrence lost its power. The female convicts faced additional horrors. Many had been prostitutes in England, not by choice, but by economic necessity. In the colony, they faced sexual exploitation from soldiers and officers. Phillip tried to encourage marriages between convicts to create stability, but these unions were often coerced. Women had almost no power or protection. Their stories from this period are heartbreaking. Many left no records, their experiences lost to history except for brief mentions in officers' journals. In June 1790, a miracle occurred. A ship appeared on the horizon, the Lady Juliana, carrying 222 female convicts and desperately needed supplies. The relief was overwhelming. People wept, but the joy was short-lived. The second fleet arrived soon after with more convicts, but these ships were nightmares. Private contractors had been hired to transport the prisoners, and these contractors were paid per convict loaded onto the ships in England, not per convict delivered alive in Australia. The result was predictable and horrific. The contractors packed the ships beyond capacity and provided minimal food and care. Of the roughly 1,000 convicts who boarded the Second Fleet ships, 267 died during the voyage. Those who arrived were walking skeletons, many too weak to walk off the ships. Disease was rampant. Dozens more died within days of landing. Governor Phillip was furious. He wrote scathing reports back to London describing the contractors as murderers. But London was far away, and letters took a year to travel each direction. This horror would repeat with later fleets. Transportation had become profitable for private companies, and profit trumped human life. Over the entire period of transportation to Australia, between 1788 and 1868, approximately 162,000 convicts would be shipped. Thousands would die on the journey. Despite everything, the starvation, the diseases, the brutal punishments, the cultural destruction, the colony slowly stabilized. Not because of brilliant planning, but because people adapted. Convicts who had been urban thieves learned to farm. Former pickpockets became carpenters. Women who had been prostitutes became the colony's first nurses and midwives. Some convicts earned their ticket of leave, a form of parole that allowed them to work for themselves while still serving their sentence. Others completed their sentences and became emancipees, free settlers. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. These former convicts didn't want to return to England. Why would they? In England, they'd been society's refuse, marked as criminals forever. In Australia, they could reinvent themselves. Land grants were offered to those who'd served their time. Former convicts became farmers, shop owners, builders. Some became wealthy. Mary Reeby, transported at age 13 for stealing a horse, became one of Australia's most successful businesswomen owning ships and property. James Roos, a former convict, became the colony's first successful farmer. These success stories began to change the colony's nature. It wasn't just a prison anymore, it was becoming a society. But we can't tell this story without acknowledging what it meant for the people who were already here. For the Eora and other Aboriginal nations around Sydney, the arrival of the First Fleet was the beginning of a catastrophe that still reverberates today. In 1789, smallpox swept through the Aboriginal population around Sydney. It killed more than half of the Eora people. Where this disease came from is debated, whether deliberately introduced or accidentally brought by the British. But the result was devastating. Aboriginal people had no immunity to European diseases. Entire family groups were wiped out. Cultural knowledge holders died. The social fabric of their society was torn apart. As the colony expanded, Aboriginal people were pushed from their traditional lands. They couldn't hunt or gather as they had for millennia because the British had cleared the land and scared away the game. When Aboriginal people speared the British's livestock, which they saw as fair game on their own land, they were hunted and killed in reprisal. What started as misunderstanding escalated into conflict and then into massacre. The official British position was that Australia was terra nullius, nobody's land, which meant they didn't need to negotiate treaties or recognize Aboriginal land ownership. This legal fiction would persist until 1992. It meant that from the British perspective, they were settling empty land. From the Aboriginal perspective, they were witnessing an invasion and the destruction of their entire world. Back in the colony, a class system was forming that would define Australian society for generations. At the top were the free settlers, people who'd come voluntarily, usually with some capital. Below them were the military officers. Then came the emancipists, former convicts who'd served their time. At the bottom were the convicts still serving sentences. But this hierarchy was unstable. The free settlers looked down on everyone else, but many emancipists were wealthier and more successful than free settlers. Officers expected deference, but often depended on convict labor. Convicts served sentences, but then might become employers themselves. It created a strange social mobility that didn't exist in Britain. This mobility became one of Australia's defining characteristics. The concept of the fair go, that everyone deserves a fair chance, emerged partly from this period. If a convicted criminal could become wealthy and respected, then perhaps birth and background mattered less than in Britain. It was a radical idea, though in practice prejudice against former convicts remained strong for decades. The colony was also remarkably multicultural for its time, though not by choice. Convicts came from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Aboriginal people were omnipresent, though increasingly marginalized. Free settlers arrived from various European countries. Even some African and Asian sailors from visiting ships decided to stay. Sydney became, almost by accident, one of the more diverse settlements in the world. Governor Phillip left Australia in 1792, his health broken by years of stress and inadequate food. He'd been stabbed by an Aboriginal warrior during one tense encounter, a spear through his shoulder that he barely survived. He returned to England, never to come back. His departure left a leadership vacuum that would take years to fill adequately. The officers of the New South Wales Corps, the military unit guarding the colony, saw an opportunity. They began using their positions to gain monopolies on imported goods and rum. Rum became the de facto currency of the colony. The officers controlled its importation and distribution, making enormous profits. They could pay convict laborers in rum and charge civilians inflated prices for goods. This rum corps essentially ruled the colony for years, enriching themselves while ordinary settlers struggled. This corruption reached its peak under Governor William Bligh. Yes, the same Bligh who'd survived the mutiny on the Bounty. Bligh arrived in 1806, determined to break the rum corps' power. He implemented reforms to end their monopolies. In response, in 1808, the Rum Corps arrested Bligh in what became known as the Rum Rebellion, the only successful armed coup in Australian history. Bligh was held prisoner for a year until a new governor arrived with enough military force to restore order. But let's return to the convicts themselves, because their experiences were the foundation of everything that followed. Transportation wasn't just about punishment, it was about labor extraction. Convicts built everything: roads, bridges, buildings, farms. They did this under conditions that would be recognized as slavery in any other context. They received minimal food, harsh discipline, and no pay except their eventual freedom. Some were assigned to work for officers or free settlers as servants. These assignments could be good or horrific, depending on the master. Some settlers treated their assigned convicts decently, providing adequate food and housing. Others worked them to death. Female convicts assigned to households faced particular vulnerability to sexual abuse. There was no meaningful recourse. Complaining about your master could result in being sent to a worse assignment or receiving additional punishment. The worst fate was being sent to a penal station, a prison within the prison. Norfolk Island, Port Arthur in Tasmania, Moreton Bay in Queensland. These places were designed for convicts who'd committed crimes within the colony. The conditions were medieval. Endless hard labor, breaking rocks, building walls that served no purpose except to provide hard labor, solitary confinement in tiny dark cells, starvation rations. The psychological torture was deliberate. These places were designed to break men's spirits. Yet even in these circumstances, humanity persisted. Convicts formed relationships. They fell in love, had children, created makeshift families. Many women married soldiers or officers, not always by choice, but sometimes genuinely. These marriages changed women's status dramatically, from prisoner to officer's wife, from the bottom of society to somewhere near the top. Children born in the colony were called currency lads and currency lasses, as opposed to sterling children born in Britain. These Australian-born children were the first generation to see Australia as home, not as punishment. They spoke with accents that mixed British regional dialects with new Australian words borrowed from Aboriginal languages. They adapted to the climate, the landscape, the culture that was forming. They were the first true Australians. By the 1830s, something remarkable had happened. The penal colony had become a real colony. Free settlers were arriving in larger numbers, attracted by land grants and opportunities. Towns were spreading, roads connected settlements, ships arrived regularly. The threat of starvation had passed, agriculture was succeeding, the sheep industry was taking off. Australia's wool would become one of the empire's most valuable exports. Transportation to New South Wales ended in 1840, though it continued to other Australian colonies until 1868. By then, approximately 162,000 convicts had been transported. Many died during the voyage or shortly after arrival. Many others lived hard lives and died young, but many survived, served their time, and built lives that would have been impossible in Britain. Here's the question that haunts this history. Was transportation a humanitarian alternative to execution, or was it cruelty disguised as mercy? From the British perspective, transportation offered criminals a second chance. Work hard, serve your time, and become a free settler in a new land. From the convict's perspective, it was banishment, forced labor, and separation from everything they knew. The answer probably depends on the individual convict's experience. For some, Australia truly was a land of opportunity, a place to escape Britain's rigid class system and make something of themselves. Mary Ryby and others like her thrived. For others, it was extended suffering, years of brutality, illness, and early death. For Aboriginal people, it was unambiguous catastrophe, the invasion that began with the First Fleet set in motion, dispossession, disease, and cultural destruction that continued for centuries. Modern Australia has a complicated relationship with this history. January 26th, the date Phillip raised the flag, is a public holiday, but increasingly controversial. For many Australians, it celebrates the founding of their nation. For Aboriginal Australians and allies, it's Invasion Day, the beginning of 250 years of dispossession and attempted cultural genocide. The convict ancestry that was once shameful has become, for many, a source of pride. Australians whose ancestors were transported now research their family histories with enthusiasm. There's something appealing about descending from rebels and survivors rather than jailers and conquerors. The convict story has been sanitized and romanticized, cleaned up for a national mythology that's more comfortable than the brutal reality. But that reality matters. The experiment Britain conducted, could you build a society with criminals, succeeded, but at enormous cost. Aboriginal civilization was nearly destroyed. Thousands of convicts suffered and died. The early colonists survived through desperation, adaptation, and the exploitation of both convict labor and Aboriginal land. What emerged was uniquely Australian, A culture that values fairness and the fair go, that's skeptical of authority, that celebrates the underdog. But these values emerge from trauma, not from some innate virtue. The prison continent became a nation. The experiment succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, though not in the way anyone intended. Britain wanted a dumping ground for criminals. What they accidentally created was a society that would eventually reject British rule and forge its own identity. The convicts wanted survival and freedom. What they built was a country that, despite its brutal origins, became one of the world's most prosperous and multicultural democracies. But success doesn't erase the cost. The suffering of those early convicts, the near annihilation of Aboriginal cultures, the brutality of the system. These aren't side notes to a triumphant story. They are the story. Australia's modern prosperity sits on foundations of injustice, forced labor, and cultural destruction. Acknowledging this doesn't diminish Australia's achievements. It makes them more complicated, more human, more real. The First Fleet's arrival on January 26, 1788, wasn't the beginning of Australian history. It was a violent interruption of one history and the painful beginning of another. Understanding both is essential to understanding Australia today. This is how the prison continent survived its brutal beginning. Not through grand planning or noble ideals, but through human resilience, accidental adaptation, and the creation of something entirely new from the wreckage of what came before.